What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. So before I get into this video, I want to give a big shout out to the brother Brendan Rowland for the $5 donation via the Cash App, all right? And he asked me who were my top 5 favorite players of all time. Now that's different from who are my top 5 players of all time. That's different. One is asking me who are my personal preferences, like as far as players I enjoy, rather than me trying to put up a fairer assessment of taking my bias or trying to take my bias out of it. Who are the top 5 players of all time? So if you're asking me my top 5 favorites, it's a pretty easy list. Number 5, I would have Dennis Rodman, which sounds crazy for coming from a Chicago Bull fan, but of course, man, if you grew up in the mid-1990s, Dennis Rodman grew on you as a Bull fan. You know, you hated him back in 1993, well, especially 1991, but by 1996, you fell in love with Dennis, man. And yeah, he's a weird dude, man, I get all of that, but Dennis was something different. You know, even though Dennis was different and provocative and all of that, you sensed that it was authentic, that it really was him. A lot of these dudes just dress weird and do all this shit to get attention and shit, but Dennis was really a fucking weirdo. But I mean, I don't mean that to be totally disparaging, but that was Dennis, right? And he brought something different. He's the first one to rock the tattoos, not Allen Iverson. Now, from the black community, Iverson was more relevant, but it was Dennis Rodman that popularized tattoos first. You know, it was Dennis Rodman that popularized the counterculture shit, because David Stern hated Dennis Rodman at one point. He wanted to kick him out the league. In 1995, before Dennis Rodman joined the Bulls, David Stern was probably going to kick Rodman out the league. The suspensions and all the trouble that he was causing and fucking with Madonna. It was to David Stern, it was a bad look for the league. Now a player doing all this stuff, you know, going to the clubs and doing all these things that appeared to be amoral, because we were in a different culture back then too. Young people don't understand that. And I might talk about that a little bit in the video politically, but man, going to play with Chicago, he fit right in as far as his work ethic. Maybe not as far as his, you know, some other aspects of his life, but the way he played, hustle, work ethic, he fit right in with Chicago, the culture, the city, the team. And the thing you liked about Dennis was whenever he was on that court, he gave you 110%. 110%, man. So when you see a lot of us get mad because guys don't fucking want to go out there and play when they're playing and missing games, well, if you watched the Chicago Bulls, if you watched the Detroit Pistons, if you watched a lot of these workhorse teams, the New York Knicks, the Miami Heat, growing up, man, you don't want to see no players saying, man, I don't want to play because I'm sad, man. You know, rebounding machine. Dennis, as a Bull, would get 15, 16 rebounds a night, right? But he could have, how can I say this? He would get 15, 16 rebounds a night, but it was also another 6 or 7 he just missed. He just couldn't get, he was like always in position. He was a genius when it came to reading rebounds. He was a genius when it came to that. So at the end of the day, Dennis was one of my favorite. My 4th favorite would be Charles Barkley. For obvious reasons, his personality. I knew when he crossed over to broadcasting, he'd be a big hit. My biggest worry was that he was going to say something to get his ass in trouble, but that really never happened. Maybe because Charles is Charles, and he's genuine. As a player, for a minute, and this gets forgotten for a minute, I would say, and this is just my opinion, okay? I'm not the be all end all, but I'm just saying, people come on here to hear our opinions, so we got to give our opinions. In my opinion, I'd say from 91 to 93, Charles was the second best player in the NBA. Would most people agree with that? I would say he was the second best player in the league. That's when Larry Bird was falling apart. Magic exited the league. You saw what Barkley was doing. Barkley should have won MVP in 1990. That was one of the closest MVP races ever. Magic just eked out Barkley. But when you looked at what Barkley had to work with in Philly, he should have won MVP in 90. He did win it in 93. Charles was a guy who was the first power forward. Now, I know people knock his percentage now, but Charles was the first power forward that I saw to really extend his range to the three-point line. You didn't really see that back then. A guy who started out totally in the paint. That's how much he worked on his game. And I think that aspect, people talk about Charles being lazy and all that, but Barkley first came in the league, he was just pretty much a guy that scored in the paint. Then around 89, 90, you start seeing Charles develop a little bit of a jumper. Then by 90, 91, you saw more of that jumper. Then by 92, he started extending to the three-point line. Now, he was never a great three-point shooter, only 26.6%, but he would have games where he would get into a rhythm and might hit back then 3-4 in the game, which was a lot. We saw that in the game when he scored 56 against the Golden State Warriors. That's another thing. Charles, for the most part, was a clutch performer in the playoffs and in big games. I remember the game in Game 7, Western Conference Finals, Sonics, Suns. Phoenix was favored. Phoenix had came back from an 0-2 deficit, almost the brink of elimination against the Lakers in the first round that year. They came all the way roaring back to go to the 7th game, the deciding game against the Sonics. I think they dropped Game 6, if I'm not mistaken, Phoenix. I think they dropped Game 6. Barkley came out, had one of the greatest performances of his life, 44 points and 24 rebounds. In 1999, when Barkley was playing with the Houston Rockets, and this is when Barkley had a bad leg, bad back, couldn't really jump anymore, fucked up, right? About 265, he had put on like 13 pounds over his old playing weight. He was playing against the Shaq and Kobe Lakers. In that series, old-ass Barkley averaged 23 points and 13 rebounds. The dude was fucking phenomenal, man. And he's one of the more underrated players, and the only thing that's missing from his resume is a championship. But I know people like to hear excuses, but man, the only thing that stopped this guy from winning a ring is Michael Jordan and Hakeem Olajuwon to me. That's it. And maybe you could even argue John Stockton in 97, but I don't know if they would have beaten the Bulls. But they could have possibly. Who knows? Number 3 to me, Larry Bird. Larry Bird. Man. Now, I'm not going to lie. I caught the tail end of Bird's career. All right? So I never saw live him in his prime. I didn't start watching the NBA until 1990. So I was a little bit of a late bloomer. But I was a quick learner. And I listened to the elders, the broadcasters. I listened to the older players talk about how great he was. Not, and I would look at an occasional older game from the 80s, which was only a few years earlier back then, and I could see what they were talking about. I remember seeing this older guy, oftentimes, sitting on the sidelines with his on the ground with his back stretched out, with a bad back and shit. And there were some games he didn't play very well. But then I saw what he was in his prime. And from 84 to 86, he was the best player in the game. Now, did he benefit from, His skin color to a certain extent. I would say this, with his popularity and some of the credit he got, a little bit. I can understand why other players got a little annoyed by that, but at the same time, Larry Bird deserved 99% of the accolades that he got because of how great a player he was. And it's not a coincidence that they've never been able to find another Larry Bird. They never will. Luka Doncic is not Larry Bird. Luka's great, but he's not Larry Bird. He can't do the things Larry Bird could do. The only thing that he got over Larry Bird, I would say, is ball handling. Ball handling. That's about it. Luka's a poor defender. Luka can't shoot like Bird. Luka can't rebound like Bird. He can't pass like Bird. He can pass, but he doesn't have the floor vision that Larry Bird has. He doesn't have the photographic memory, and the anticipation that Bird had. Bird was a phenomenal player, man. And yes, he played with some other great players, but so did everybody else in that era. Magic, Kareem, Isaiah later on, Dr. J. They all the Bucks teams. They all had great players on their team. So Larry Bird's up there. Now, when I say favorite players, Wilt is at number 2. I've talked about Wilt Chamberlain enough. I think he's the most dominant player of all time. 30 points per game, 23 rebounds per game, 4.5 assists per game. Of course, his Achilles heel is free throw shooting, 7 scoring titles, strongest player to ever play the game. If it wasn't for Bill Russell, Wilt may have had 5 or 6 championships. I don't know. It's hard to say. But the biggest knock on Wilt is that he didn't win enough in a lot of people's minds. He should have won more. But when I look at what Wilt did as a basketball player, from the stats that are already out there, plus the stats that we never got to see, but you can only sort of estimate or guesstimate, when you guesstimate that the guy averaged probably 6 blocks per game for his career, when you guesstimate that he probably had at least 500 triple doubles in his career, when you see the fact that he's had some incredible dominant performances. Wilt Chamberlain is my second favorite. And of course my favorite, man. I'm a Chicago Bull fan. So number 1 is Michael Jordan. Is my favorite player. I mean, it's obvious. Look at my other channel. He's my favorite. Am I biased? I mean, fuck, man. We're all biased to an extent, man. To me, Jordan, I've never seen a guy who was able to raise his or elevate his game to the moment as consistently as he did. Like, whenever he would have a dominant scoring performance, it seemed like, number 1, he always shot well. And number 2, he tended to do it either against an elite opponent or in a game that was important. It was some level of importance to the game. Like, I remember, one time he did drop 49 points, almost 50 against the Clippers. But what was important about that game was Jordan had to take over the game because they had not won a road game yet. This was early in the 97-98 season when they were struggling. And they needed to get that monkey off their back, and Jordan did it. He elevated his game. He was earlier in the game not shooting well, but then he took over and wound up with 49. But most of his great performances came against top competition, whether it was the Heat in the late 90s, the Knicks, the Cavaliers of the 80s and early 90s, the Boston Celtics of the 80s. He even had a 54-point game against Showtime Lakers. He had 8 playoff games of 50 points or more. twice more than anybody else. Second place is Wilt with 4. In the finals, he had a 55-point game in 1993. So when you look at him, he rose his level of play more so than anybody else. When you factor that in with the competitiveness and the dominance on both ends of the floor, I've just never seen a guy dominate a game the way that he did. And the fact that he did that within the triangle offense, too, was amazing in the second three-peat. He didn't always have the ball in his hands, too. Contrary to popular opinion, in 1996 and 1997, Pippen had the ball more often than Michael Jordan did in the triangle offense. He handled the ball more than Mike. So this nonsense that he was just a ball hog, that's not true. His role in the offense was to score, but Michael could also facilitate. Michael could be an all-around guy. Michael could focus on defense, but he was just a man. I mean, you just had to be there. That's all I can say. You just had to be there and experience when Michael Jordan was playing to understand why. It's just. I laugh when people like me making arguments about LeBron, man. I just be like, man, get out of my face with this shit, man. And LeBron's a great player, man, but he ain't no Michael Jordan. Shit, to me, he's not ain't no Magic Johnson, man. But anyway, that's all I got to say about it. Tell me what you guys think.